One of the things I love about gardening is that our garden always has something new to teach us. Every year we grow new crops, try new techniques, and learn from our experiences. Today I'll share what new crops and techniques we tried this year, what worked, what didn't work, and what we learned from our experiences. We also found that our small tomato varieties. Hello. Let's start by taking a look at some of the new crops we grew this year. Without a doubt, the standout among our new crops was our straight-eight cucumbers. Though we've grown cucumbers for many years, we've never seen production that comes anywhere close to what we saw with our straight-eights. With just one 4x8 trellis dedicated to cucumbers, the straight-eights nearly overwhelmed us. We also enjoyed their taste and tried a number of new recipes to try to keep up with them. This week I hope to make lacto-fermented dill pickles with the current surplus. Though there may be additional factors leading to such a great harvest this year, I always make a note of any new variety that produces particularly well and make sure to grow that variety again in the future to see if it performs similarly in subsequent years. The next standout crop this year was our Trionfo Violetto pole beans. They're not only beautiful and taste great, but they're incredibly productive. We planted fewer than 20 seeds around the garden and could barely keep up with the harvest. If you follow me on Facebook, you've seen picture after picture of harvests featuring these beautiful purple beans, and most of them were grown on the 3 hoops I was just standing in front of. We've grown beans for many years and have never seen production like this before. The beans turn green when cooked and taste great. As I said earlier about the cucumbers, there may have been other factors contributing to how well these beans did this year. But anytime we grow a new variety that does this well, we grow it again. We also grew a number of new tomato varieties this year, including large tomatoes, which we haven't grown for years because of limited sun in the garden. Though we enjoyed all the tomatoes that we grew, we had mixed results in terms of productivity and disease resistance. While the tried and true sweet million cherry tomatoes that we've grown for years are still thriving and producing, many of the new varieties were lost to blight in August and early September. Dester tomatoes were the first to go, and Reisentraub cherry tomatoes soon followed. Of the new large tomatoes, Cherokee purples were the least affected by blight and were also our favorite tasting. Needless to say, with that combination we'll grow them again. The unfortunately named Ice's Candy tomato is by far our favorite new cherry tomato. It's so sweet and tasty that it could be the best tasting cherry tomato I've ever had. The plants were also relatively healthy, so we'll definitely grow them again. Other new varieties that we plan to try again include Black Vernissage, Big Rainbow, Pink Boar, and Blush. We also found that our small tomato varieties, especially sweet million cherry tomatoes, were much more productive than the larger tomatoes. Even so, we'll continue to experiment with growing large tomato varieties, in part because of an unexpected change in the garden that will make it easier to grow them. 2 very large trees near our property that shaded the garden in the morning were recently cut down, apparently to prevent them from falling. Though I hated to see the trees go, their removal will give us a couple more hours of direct sun to work with. So after years of learning to grow in the shade, we'll now have the opportunity to learn what we can grow with 8 hours of direct sun in some parts of the garden. The extra sun will definitely help with our tomatoes. Now let's take a look at some of the techniques and strategies we tried this year and how well they worked out. Encouraged by mild weather late in the winter, we started cool weather crops under cover earlier than ever before in late winter and early spring. We started sugar snap peas, lettuce, spinach, radishes, potatoes, parsnips, carrots, arugula, beets, pak choi, and turnips under cold frames and low tunnels in March. Because I was planting under cover, I was able to start these crops 3 to 4 weeks earlier than the recommended planting dates. Of course, I also took the extended weather forecast into account before planting. Because we planted early, by the time most gardens in our area were just getting started, we were already harvesting cool weather crops. I also started cucumbers, zucchini, and cushaw squash before the last frost under cold frames. Though I don't recall ever losing cool weather crops to the cold when starting early under cover, there's definitely a risk when starting summer crops outside before the last frost. So I would never start all of my summer crops early and risk losing everything. But I think it makes sense to try starting a few summer crops early under cover, especially ones that can easily be replanted after the last frost. This year the cucumbers, cushaw squash, and zucchini I started early all did very well, and I'll definitely push the limits with some of our summer crops next year too. We also expanded our front yard garden this year by growing peppers, eggplant, and basil in grow bags inside steel fire rings in the front yard. We got the idea to use the fire rings from Luke at MI Gardener. Since we're technically not supposed to have a vegetable garden in the front yard, the attractive fire rings allow us to conceal the less attractive grow bags. At the same time, if the city ever told us we had to remove the veggies from the front yard, we could just pick up the grow bags and carry them to the backyard. Fortunately, we haven't run into any problems so far and have received compliments on the garden from many neighbors and passersby. So we'll continue to push the limits of the front yard veggie garden a little bit more every year. Next, I increased our tomato production this year by growing more tomato plants than ever before. To make this possible, I had to grow many of the plants in areas of the garden that get very little direct sun. To my pleasant surprise, most of these plants did very well. For example, in the past, I would have never grown a tomato that is shaded on the east by blackberry bushes, on the south by our house, and on the west by trees. This plant didn't get any direct sun at all until it grew to about my height. Even so, the plant has been very productive and is still producing fruit. Of course, I'll continue to reserve sunnier spots for most of our tomatoes, but it's good to know that when we want to grow more, we can grow them in areas with less than ideal sun. Now let's look at how we increase production of another one of our favorite summer crops. My wife insisted that we grow more beans this year, but it's always a challenge to find room to grow more crops. So we experimented growing beans in a variety of different locations around the garden, including up the hoops of this hoop house, which worked very well, even though this area only got about 3 to 4 hours of direct sun during the summer. This area of the garden usually isn't very productive during the summer because of limited sun. But the hoops made a great home for our Trionfo Violetto pole beans, which was a great new way to make good use of the space. We also planted a couple bean seeds at the bottom of some of our single-stem tomatoes that were growing on stakes. This gave us a boost to our bean production without taking up any space, and it didn't appear to bother the tomatoes at all. I probably wouldn't grow pole beans in the same space as unpruned indeterminate tomatoes, but because these tomatoes are pruned and separated on stakes, there's plenty of room for a couple bean plants to wind their way up an individual tomato. Finally, this year I grew our zucchini and patty pan squash vertically on stakes. This definitely reduced the amount of space the plants took up and gave us more room to grow other crops, but it also required more work. It's now getting towards the end of the growing season, and this patty pan is still hanging in there. But my failure to properly tie the zucchini to the stake led to its early demise a few weeks ago. I used 8-foot 2x2s for the stakes and cut a point on the bottom of each. I then made shallow angled cuts every foot or so, starting a couple feet from the bottom and ending near the top. I placed the stakes just north of the plants with the angled cuts pointing down at the plants and drove them about a foot into the ground. I then secured the plant stems to the stakes with garden tape and elevated the leaves by tying them with garden tape and twine to the angled cuts on the stakes. As the plants grew, I removed leaves that were no longer healthy and continued to tie the growing stem and new leaves to the stake. I also removed a second leader that developed on the zucchini. Unfortunately, I didn't stay on top of tying the zucchini to the stake as it grew, and it became too top-heavy. A heavy thunderstorm in August snapped the stem in half, ending our zucchini harvest for the year. On the positive side, the zucchini plant produced very well while it lasted, and it didn't take up much space. However, even if I had stayed on top of securing the plant to the stake, I'm not sure if the extra effort would have been worth the benefits. The patty pan, on the other hand, was much easier to grow vertically and took less work. So unless I learn of a better approach, I don't think I'll try to grow zucchini vertically next year, but I may give it another go with patty pans. I love that our gardens always have something new to teach us. With experimentation and careful observation, we can continue to grow along with our gardens. The learning opportunities are truly endless. If you'd like, please let me know in a comment below what you learned from your garden this year. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.